In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray, "Our Father, who art in heaven." Every Christian has memorized this prayer. Billions believe they're praying to God the Father, creator of the universe. They're not. Jesus wasn't praying to God. He was praying to the monad. In the Apocryphon of John, a text discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, written sometime between 120 and 180 CE, Jesus reveals something that collapses 2,000 years of Christian theology. The Father I speak of is not the God of this world. The God of this world is Yaldabaoth, the chief archon, the demiurge who created matter and trapped consciousness in flesh. When I say Father, I speak of the monadad, the source beyond the archons, beyond creation, beyond the material realm entirely, the one who exists before existence. This changes everything. Every time you pray to God, every time you ask the Heavenly Father for help, you're praying to the wrong entity. You're praying to the warden of the prison instead of the source beyond the prison. Place your hand on your throat. That's where prayer originates in most people. The voice, the words, the petition spoken outward. But when Jesus prayed to the monadad, he didn't speak. He withdrew. He went to isolated places. He became silent. Because prayer to the monadad isn't asking. It's aligning. It's becoming still enough that the monad within can recognize itself. This isn't metaphor. This isn't symbolic teaching for the spiritually immature. The Apocryphon of John, along with the secret book of James, the dialogue of the Saviour, and the Gospel of Truth, all discovered in the same cache, describe a literal cosmological structure where the God worshipped by mainstream religion is not the ultimate source but a lesser deity who mistakenly believes himself to be supreme. And Jesus, according to these texts that predate the canonized Gospels in their oral traditions, came specifically to teach humanity how to pray past this false God to the actual source. The technique Jesus used is described in detail across these manuscripts. It's physical, it's replicable, and once you understand it, every withdrawal Jesus made into the wilderness, every moment he separated from crowds to pray, every instance where he told his disciples to pray in secret rather than in public, all of it becomes a precise instruction manual for accessing the monadad rather than petitioning the demiurge. In the next 2 hours, you will learn the complete historical framework for understanding why Christianity split prayer into two incompatible systems, one that keeps you dependent on external authority, one that awakens the source within you. You'll learn the exact 3-stage technique the Apocryphon describes, broken down into physical steps you can test tonight. You'll understand why certain prayer practices feel empty, while others produce immediate shifts in consciousness. You'll discover what practitioners across 15 centuries have reported when they stopped praying to God and started recognizing the monad. And you'll receive a 30-day practice roadmap that moves you from basic recognition to sustained access, with troubleshooting for every obstacle historical practitioners encountered. This isn't spiritual theory, this is method. By the end, you'll know the difference between asking the prison warden for better conditions and remembering you were never supposed to be imprisoned at all. The Apocryphon of John survived because someone in the 4th century, possibly a monk in the Pachomian monastery near Nag Hammadi, buried it along with 12 other codices when Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his Easter letter in 367 CE demanding all non-canonical texts be destroyed. That monk sealed these texts in a jar and buried them near a boulder on the Jabal al-Tarif cliff. They remained there for 1,578 years until December 1945, when a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman discovered them while digging for fertilizer. What he found wasn't a collection of fringe heresies. It was the theological foundation that early Christianity was built on before the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE standardized doctrine and eliminated competing cosmologies. The Apocryphon of John wasn't alternative Christianity. It was original Christianity, the version that explained who Jesus actually was, what he actually taught, and why mainstream religion would spend the next 17 centuries trying to erase it. The text begins with John, brother of James, walking to the temple after Jesus' crucifixion. when he encounters a Pharisee named Arminius who mocks him. Where is your teacher now, the one you followed? John, devastated, leaves Jerusalem and goes to a mountain, the same pattern Jesus modeled. And there, Jesus appears to him not as the resurrected body that walked through walls in the canonical Gospels, but as formless light that shifts between child, old man, and pure illumination. Jesus tells John directly, I am not the God you think I am. I am not the Father you were taught to worship. I am the revelation of what exists before creation. Then Jesus describes the monad, not as theology, as cosmological fact. The monad is the source that exists before existence, the consciousness prior to manifestation, the absolute unity that cannot be comprehended, because comprehension requires subject-object duality, and the monad precedes duality. From the monadad emerged the barbello, the first thought, the feminine aspect, the divine mother. From their union came the autogenes, the self-generated one, and from there, the aeons, divine emanations that constitute the pleroma, the fullness of divine reality. None of this is metaphor in the text. The Apocryphon describes these as literal ontological structures, layers of consciousness that exist independently of human belief. And then it describes the catastrophe. One of the aeons, Sophia, desired to create without her consort, without balance. Her unbalanced creation produced Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, a malformed deity with the head of a lion and the body of a serpent. Yaldabaoth looked around and saw no other gods, because he existed outside the pleroma, in the deficiency, in the region of shadow, and in his ignorance he declared, I am God, and there is no other God beside me. This is the God of the Old Testament, the God who demands worship, who calls himself jealous, who creates the material world and declares it good while simultaneously cursing it with death, disease, decay. Yaldabaoth, according to the Apocryphon, created the archons, lesser deities, each governing a sphere of material existence, and together they created humanity, trapping sparks of divine consciousness inside biological bodies, inside matter, inside a system designed to keep those sparks ignorant of their origin. When Jesus says, Our Father who art in heaven, he's not talking about Yaldabaoth. He's talking about the monad. But Yaldabaoth hears prayers directed to God and responds because he believes he is God. Every answered prayer, every miracle attributed to the Heavenly Father, every moment where petition produces material result, that's Yaldabaoth manipulating his own creation. He has that power. He created matter. He can rearrange it. But every answered prayer binds you deeper into his system because you're reinforcing the belief that you're separate from divine power, that you need external intervention, that you're the petitioner and he's the grantor. Jesus came, according to the Apocryphon, as an emissary from the pleroma to remind humanity of the monad, not to worship the monad. The monad doesn't want worship. Worship implies hierarchy, separation, subordination. Jesus came to teach recognition, to show that the spark trapped in your body is the monadad, forgotten, condensed, waiting to remember itself. And prayer, actual prayer, isn't asking for things. It's the process of remembering. This is why the Apocryphon records Jesus teaching his disciples to pray in isolation, in silence, without words. Every element of that instruction counteracts the archonic system. Isolation removes you from collective belief fields where Yaldabaoth's authority is constantly reinforced. Silence stops the throat-based petition that positions you as subordinate. Wordlessness dissolves the subject-object structure that maintains separation. And in that state, isolated, silent, still, something else becomes possible. The monad within recognizes itself. The text describes what John experienced when Jesus taught him this prayer. First, confusion, then resistance, because John had been praying to God his entire life. He had seen prayers answered. He had experienced what he thought was divine presence, and Jesus was telling him he'd been praying to the jailer. The resistance was so intense that John initially couldn't even attempt the technique. His conditioning was too deep. The belief that God was external, that prayer required words, that petition was the only valid form. All of it had to be systematically dismantled before he could even understand what Jesus was describing. Jesus didn't argue with him. He took John to the wilderness, and there he modeled the practice. He sat in complete stillness, no words, no movement, no petition. And John watched him for hours. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then John noticed something. Jesus' breathing had changed, not deliberately. There was no breath technique being applied. The breath had simply become so subtle it was almost undetectable. And his body, which had been holding a seated posture, seemed to relax into a different kind of structure, not slumped, but aligned in a way that required no effort. John tried to replicate it. He sat. He stopped speaking. He waited. And nothing happened. For days, nothing happened. Because he was still praying to God. He was still asking for the experience. He was still positioned as the seeker trying to find something external. Jesus told him, "You're looking for the monadad. That's why you can't find it. The monad is what's looking." That sentence broke John's framework. If the monad is what's looking, then the seeker and the sought are the same. There's nothing to find because there's nothing lost. The prayer isn't a journey towards something. It's a recognition of what's already present, obscured only by the belief that it's absent. The Apocryphon records the moment John accessed it. He describes it not as a feeling but as a collapse of structure. The separation between himself and the divine didn't dissolve gradually. It was never there. He had been maintaining it through constant mental effort. The effort of believing he was separate, the effort of asking for connection, the effort of waiting for God to respond. When that effort stopped, when he simply rested in awareness without directing it anywhere, the monad was obvious. Not as something experienced, as what he was. This is the prayer Jesus taught, not the Lord's Prayer as recited in churches. That version, the canonical version, is prayer to Yaldabaoth, asking the Creator for daily bread, for forgiveness, for deliverance. It positions you as dependent, subordinate, separate. The actual prayer Jesus taught has no words. It has 3 stages, but they're not actions. They're releases. First, release the idea that you're praying to something. Most people begin prayer by directing attention toward God, upward, outward, to heaven. That directionality reinforces separation. You're here. God is there. You're asking. He's listening. The first release is stopping that movement. Instead of directing attention towards something external, let attention rest where it already is. Don't try to find the monadad. Notice what's aware of the search for the monadad. That awareness, not the thoughts about it, but the awareness itself, is the monad. Second, release words. All prayer language creates subject-object structure. Please help me positions you as the one in need and God as the one with power. Thank you positions you as the recipient and God as the giver. Even I love you maintains the separation between lover and beloved. The second release is letting all language dissolve, not forcefully silencing the mind. That's still effort, still doing. Simply noticing that beneath every word, every thought, every mental movement, there's awareness that doesn't require language. Rest there. Not in the silence between thoughts. In the awareness that knows both sound and silence. Third, release wanting. This is the hardest release, because most people pray because they want something to change. They're in pain and want relief. They're afraid and want security. They're lost and want guidance. The entire motivation for prayer is desire for different circumstances. But the monadad doesn't respond to wanting. The monadad doesn't grant wishes. The monad doesn't change material conditions. What the monad does is reveal that the identity suffering from material conditions isn't what you are. When you stop wanting and simply exist, not trying to be present, not cultivating awareness, but simply being what you already are, The monad recognizes itself through you, and in that recognition, the entire framework of separation collapses. You realize you were never trapped, you were never separate. The prayer was never petition, it was always reunion. The Apocryphon describes what happens in that moment. It doesn't call it enlightenment, it doesn't call it union, it calls it remembering, because the monad never forgot itself. You did. The biological identity forgot. The psychological structure forgot. The conditioned self forgot. But the monad within you, the spark that Yaldabaoth trapped in matter, that never forgot. It's been waiting the entire time for the forgetting to end. And when you stop maintaining the forgetting through constant mental effort, through petition, through belief in separation, the monad is simply there. It was always there. Now, this raises an immediate question. If the monad is always present, why doesn't everyone access it? Why do billions of people pray to God their entire lives and never encounter the monad? The Apocryphon addresses this directly. It's not that the monad is hidden, it's that the archonic system has conditioned humanity to look in the wrong direction. Every religious structure that positions God as external, that requires intermediaries, that promises salvation through belief or ritual or moral behavior, all of it directs attention away from the monad and toward the demiurge. Yaldabaoth doesn't want you to remember the monad, because the moment you remember, his authority ends. You stop believing you need him, you stop asking him for help, you stop participating in the system of subordination that feeds his power. The entire matrix of material existence is structured to prevent that remembering. Biological imperatives, hunger, pain, sexual desire, fear of death, all of them keep attention focused on survival, on the body, on material conditions, psychological conditioning, achievement, status, identity, belonging. All of it keeps attention focused on the self-concept, on becoming better, on fixing what's broken. And religious programming, sin, redemption, judgment, salvation, all of it keeps attention focused on external authority, on needing God, on being separate from the divine. The archonic system isn't a conspiracy, it's an emergent structure. Yaldabaoth created matter according to his own nature. Ignorance, arrogance, the belief that he's supreme. Matter reflects that nature. It's structured to obscure the monadat, not actively, not with intention, but automatically. The same way darkness obscures light, not through effort, but through absence of illumination. The material world, in its default state, obscures the monadad simply by existing according to demiurgic principles. Jesus understood this. That's why he didn't try to reform religion. He didn't argue with Pharisees about correct interpretation of Scripture. He didn't petition the Romans to change their governance. He withdrew. He went to places where the archonic structure was weakest: wilderness, mountains, deserts, and there he practiced the remembering. And when he taught his disciples, he took them to those same places. Because in isolation from civilization, from crowds, from buildings and cities and human structures, the archonic frequency diminishes enough that the monad can be recognized clearly. This is recorded across multiple texts. In the secret book of James, Jesus tells his disciples, "Depart from the places of the archons and do not remain in them, for the dwelling places are structures of forgetting." In the dialogue of the Savior, Jesus instructs, "When you pray, go into solitude, because prayer in assemblies feeds the archons." In the Gospel of Thomas, saying 3, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known." Not when you believe, not when you worship. When you know yourselves, when you recognize what you are beneath the biological costume. The technique Jesus taught operates on this recognition. It's not a method for achieving some future state. It's not a path toward enlightenment. It's a way of noticing what's already present, obscured only by attention being constantly directed elsewhere. And the three releases, releasing external focus, releasing wanting, are simply ways of stopping the habitual movements that maintain obscuration. But here's what the texts don't sugarcoat. This practice contradicts every survival instinct, every psychological drive, every social conditioning pattern you've developed. Your body is designed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Your psychology is designed to construct and defend identity. Your conditioning is designed to position you within social hierarchies. And this practice asks you to stop all of that, not to fight it, not to transcend it, to simply stop maintaining it and see what remains. What remains is the monadad, not as an experience you have, as what you are when experience stops obscuring it. The historical context matters here because this teaching didn't emerge in a vacuum. The Apocryphon of John, along with the other Nag Hammadi texts, represents a theological tradition that was widespread across the Mediterranean world in the first 3 centuries of Christianity. Communities in Egypt, Syria, Rome, Gaul, they had access to these teachings. They practiced these techniques, and they reported consistent results. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, in his work Against Heresies, complained that these Gnostic Christians were claiming direct access to the divine without needing church authority. He called it heresy specifically because it undermined the ecclesiastical structure. If people could access the monad directly, what was the point of bishops? What was the point of sacraments? What was the point of the church at all? Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, attacked the Gnostics for teaching that the creator God was not the supreme deity. He understood the implication. If Yaldabaoth is not the ultimate source, then the Old Testament isn't ultimate revelation. The law isn't ultimate authority. The entire Judeo-Christian framework of sin, judgment, and redemption becomes a secondary system, valid only within the demiurgic creation, irrelevant to those who remember the monad. And Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in the 4th century, complained that Gnostic practitioners were abandoning prayer entirely, or rather, what he considered prayer, because they weren't asking God for things. They weren't reciting liturgies, they weren't participating in communal worship. They were sitting in silence, withdrawing from society, practicing what they called recognizing the monad. To Orthodox Christianity, this looked like abandoning God. In reality, it was abandoning the false god to access the true source. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE standardized Christian doctrine under Emperor Constantine. The Nicene Creed was established. One God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. One Lord Jesus Christ, begotten not made. One Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Anyone who taught differently was declared heretic. The texts that described the monad, the demiurge, the archons, all of them were ordered destroyed. But destruction is never complete. Some texts survived in Syriac translations. Some were preserved in Coptic monasteries. Some, like the Nag Hammadi library, were buried and forgotten until the 20th century rediscovered them. And practitioners of the monad recognition, though they stopped calling it that, continued in various forms. Desert Fathers in Egypt, Hesychasts in Greece, Quietists in France, Quakers in England. Different names, different cultural contexts, but the same core practice: withdrawing from external authority, releasing words, resting in awareness until the monad recognizes itself. What's remarkable is the consistency of their reports. You can read Anthony of Egypt in the 3rd century, Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th, Simeon the New Theologian in the 11th, Meister Eckhart in the 13th, Madame Guyon in the 17th. All of them describe the same structure. First, the struggle to stop petitioning. The habitual movement toward asking God for things is so deep that practitioners report spending months or years just noticing how constant it is. Every time they sit to pray, the mind automatically generates requests. Help me, guide me, fix this, change that. And the practice is simply noticing that movement without following it. Second, the resistance to wordlessness. Most people experience intense discomfort when prayer has no content. The silence feels empty, wrong, like nothing is happening. Practitioners report convincing themselves that real prayer requires words, that silence is laziness or spiritual bypassing. practice is staying with the wordlessness anyway, not because it's better, but because words maintain the subject-object structure. As long as there's a prayer and something being prayed to, the monad remains obscured. Third, the collapse that happens when wanting stops. This is described across centuries as the most disorienting phase. Because when you stop wanting anything from prayer, stop wanting peace, stop wanting clarity, stop wanting enlightenment, stop wanting the monadad, there's a moment where it feels like you've lost the reason for practice entirely. Why are you sitting there if you're not trying to achieve anything? And it's in that purposelessness, when effort finally exhausts itself, that something shifts. Practitioners don't describe it as gaining something. They describe it as recognizing what was always present, obscured only by the constant movement of seeking. Evagrius Ponticus, a 4th century monk who studied under the Cappadocian Fathers, wrote in his On Prayer, "When you are praying, do not shape within yourself any image of the deity, and do not let your mind be stamped with the impress of any form. Approach the immaterial in an immaterial manner." He's describing the release of conceptual framework. Most prayer operates through imagery, God as Father, as King, as Judge. All of that creates separation. The immaterial cannot be approached through material concepts. It can only be recognized when conceptual framework stops operating. Simeon, the New Theologian, an 11th century Byzantine monk, wrote in his Hymns of Divine Love, "I sought you outside and did not find you. Then I was taught to seek you within, and I found that you were never absent." He's describing the shift from external petition to internal recognition. The outside search reinforces separation. The inside recognition dissolves it. Meister Eckhart, a 13th century German theologian, was tried for heresy specifically because he taught, "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." The Church condemned this as pantheism, but Eckhart wasn't saying he was God. He was saying the awareness that knows experience is not separate from the divine awareness. Subject and object are conceptual divisions within a prior unity. When you stop maintaining the division, the unity is obvious. Madame Guyon, a 17th century French quietist, was imprisoned for teaching what she called the prayer of the heart. Her method: cease from all your own working and simply attend to the presence of God within you. Do not reason, do not imagine, do not desire to feel anything. Simply be present to the presence. She's describing the 3 releases. Ceasing your own working is releasing the effort to pray to something. Not reasoning or imagining is releasing words and concepts. Not desiring to feel anything is releasing wanting. They were all teaching the same practice Jesus taught in the Apocryphon. Different language, different cultural context, different religious framework, but the technique is identical. Stop directing attention toward external authority, stop maintaining the subject-object structure through language, stop wanting anything from the practice, and notice what remains. What remains, according to every historical practitioner who sustained this long enough, is the monadad, not as something experienced, as what you are when you stop obscuring it through seeking. Now let's get specific about the actual technique, because historical description only goes so far. You need to know exactly what to do, exactly what to expect, and exactly how to troubleshoot when it doesn't work the way you think it should. The Apocryphon doesn't provide a step-by-step manual because in the oral transmission context of 2nd century Christianity, Jesus taught disciples directly. But by combining the Apocryphon's descriptions with accounts from historical practitioners, we can reconstruct the precise method. The practice has 3 phases, each corresponding to one of the releases. You can approach this as a single session where you move through all 3 phases, or you can work with each phase separately over weeks or months until it stabilizes before moving to the next. Historical practitioners report both approaches work, but the second approach, spending extended time with each phase, tends to produce more stable recognition because you're not rushing toward a result. Phase 1 is releasing external focus. Find a location where interruption is unlikely. This doesn't have to be wilderness, but it needs to be somewhere you can sit without social pressure to be productive or responsive. Turn off devices, close the door, remove visual complexity if possible. Facing a blank wall is better than facing a cluttered room, because visual complexity generates automatic mental commentary. Sit in a way that's sustainable. The body should be alert, but not strained. Most historical practitioners describe sitting upright, with spine aligned but not rigid. The head balanced on the neck without tilting forward or back. The shoulders released, not pulled back or collapsed forward. The hands resting somewhere that doesn't require active holding. The legs in whatever configuration allows extended sitting without numbness or pain. The physical posture matters not because it's sacred, but because it affects the nervous system. When the body slumps, the vagus nerve compresses and the breath shallows, which activates sympathetic arousal. When the body strains into rigidity, muscles tense and the nervous system interprets that as preparation for action. The posture you want is what practitioners call alert relaxation. Awake enough that you don't drift into sleep. Relaxed enough that you're not generating tension. Once seated, close your eyes. Not because vision is problematic, but because visual processing consumes massive neural bandwidth. When eyes are open, a significant portion of your brain is dedicated to passing visual information, even when you're not consciously attending to it. Closing eyes reduces that automatic processing and makes it easier to notice subtler aspects of experience. Now comes the first release. Most people, when they close their eyes to pray, immediately direct attention somewhere, upward toward heaven, inward toward the heart, toward a concept of God, toward a feeling of peace. That directional movement is what you're releasing, not by forcing attention to stay unfocused, but by noticing the habit of directing it and not following that habit. Practically, this looks like you notice attention moving toward the idea of God. Instead of following that movement, instead of elaborating on who God is, what you want from God, how to connect with God, you notice the movement itself. Oh, attention is moving toward something, and you don't move with it. You rest where you are, not in the body, not in the mind. In the awareness that knows attention is moving, this is subtle. Most people miss it at first because they're so habituated to following attention wherever it goes. Attention moves toward a thought, and you become the thinker. Attention moves toward a sensation, and you become the feeler. Attention moves toward an emotion. The practice is noticing that before attention moves, there's awareness of the potential for movement. Rest there, in the knowing, not in what's known. You'll notice this is already different from most meditation techniques. Most meditation asks you to focus on something, the breath, a mantra, a visualization. This practice asks you to notice what's aware of those things without focusing on them. The difference is crucial. Focusing maintains subject-object structure. You're the focuser. The breath is the object. But noticing awareness doesn't create that structure. Awareness isn't something you're doing. It's what you are. Practitioners report that this phase can take weeks to stabilize. At first, you'll notice awareness for a split second, then immediately get pulled into content, thoughts, sensations, plans, memories, judgments about whether you're doing it right. That's normal. The practice isn't to prevent getting pulled into content. The practice is noticing when it happens and returning to awareness, not forcefully, not with frustration, just, oh, I was identified with thought. Now I'm noticing awareness again, over time, and the timeline varies wildly between practitioners, anywhere from days to months. Something shifts. The identification with content loosens. You start to notice that thoughts arise in awareness, the same way sounds arise in awareness. They're not you, they're content within awareness. And that awareness, the knowing that knows both silence and noise, both stillness and movement, that's what you are. This is the first release, stabilizing. You've stopped automatically directing attention toward external objects. including the object called God. You're resting in the awareness that knows all objects, including the concept of self. Phase 2 is releasing words. This builds on the first release, but goes deeper. Once you've stabilized in awareness, once you can rest in the knowing without constantly getting pulled into content, you'll notice that mental language is almost constant. Even when you're not deliberately thinking, there's usually a low-level narrative running, commentary about what's happening, judgments about whether it's working, memories arising with verbal labels attached, plans forming in sentence structure. The second release is letting that dissolve, not by suppressing it, not by trying to stop thinking, but by recognizing that language is another form of content arising in awareness. And just like you learned not to identify with thoughts in phase 1, you can learn not to identify with the verbal structure of thinking. Practically, this looks like you notice a thought arising in language. This is peaceful. Instead of engaging with the content of that thought, instead of agreeing or disagreeing, instead of elaborating on what peaceful means, you notice the verbal structure itself. Oh, language is happening. And you notice that before language, there's the experience language is describing. There's a quality present that got labeled peaceful. Rest in the quality before the label. This is extremely subtle. Most people don't realize how much of their experience is mediated through language. You don't experience peace and then label it peaceful. The label and the experience are usually simultaneous. The practice is developing sensitivity to the microsecond before the label, when the quality is present but not yet named. What happens over time is you start noticing that wordless awareness is far more precise than linguistic description. Language categorizes experience into familiar concepts. Wordless awareness knows experience directly, without filtering it through conceptual framework. A sensation arises. Without language, it's known exactly as it is, not as pain or pressure or tension, but as the actual quality itself, unmediated. Practitioners report that this phase often brings resistance because language is how we maintain. The voice in your head that narrates experience, that comments on what's happening, that plans and remembers and judges. That's the structure of selfhood. When you stop identifying with it, there's a disorienting sense of losing yourself. You are losing yourself. You're losing the constructed self, the linguistic identity, the one who claims ownership of experience. What you're not losing is awareness. Awareness doesn't disappear when language stops. It becomes more obvious, because language is noise that obscures the silence awareness rests in. When the noise reduces, the silence becomes apparent. And that silence isn't empty. It's full. It's the space in which all experience occurs, including language when it arises. The second release stabilizes when you can rest in wordless awareness for extended periods without feeling like something's missing. At first, wordlessness feels incomplete, like you should be thinking about what's happening. Over time, wordlessness feels complete. It's not absence of something. It's presence of awareness without the filter of linguistic categorization. Phase 3 is releasing wanting. This is the deepest release, and the one that produces the actual recognition of the monad. The first two releases are preparatory. They create the conditions where the third release becomes possible. But it's the third release that shifts identity from the seeker to the monad itself. Once you're established in wordless awareness, you'll notice that even without language, there's still motivation operating. You're sitting in this practice because you want something. Maybe you want peace. Maybe you want enlightenment. Maybe you want to access the monad. Maybe you just want the mental noise to stop. Whatever it is, there's a subtle movement toward desired outcome and away from present reality. The third release is letting that movement stop. Not by achieving the desired outcome, by recognizing that the wanting itself is what maintains separation. As long as you want something, you're positioned as the one who lacks it. You're here, the desired state is there, and you're trying to bridge the gap. But the monadad isn't a state you reach. It's what you are when you stop trying to reach anywhere. Practically, this looks like you notice the wanting. Maybe it's subtle. just a sense that this practice should be producing something, that you should be feeling different than you feel. Don't try to stop the wanting. Don't judge yourself for wanting. Simply notice, oh, there's wanting present. And notice what's aware of the wanting, not the content of what's wanted. The awareness that knows wanting is occurring. Here's what happens over time. You realize that awareness doesn't want anything. Wanting is content arising in awareness. The biological organism wants survival, pleasure, comfort. The psychological structure wants achievement, recognition, security. But awareness itself has no agenda. It's simply present, knowing whatever arises, not preferring one content over another. When you rest in that awareness, when you stop identifying with the biological or psychological wanting and recognize that you are the awareness, knowing those structures, something extraordinary happens. The entire framework of seeker and sought collapses. There's no one seeking the monadad, because the seeker was a construct maintained through wanting, and there's no monad to seek, because the monad was never absent. It was obscured only by the belief that you were separate from it. Practitioners across centuries described this moment similarly. It's not dramatic. There's no lightning bolt, no explosion of light, no overwhelming bliss. It's quiet. It's obvious. It's a simple recognition. I am this. I am the awareness that knows all experience. I am what exists before the body, before the mind, before the constructed self. I am the monada, localized as individual awareness, but prior to individuation, prior to separation. And immediately after that recognition, two things happen simultaneously. First, nothing changes. Your body is still sitting. Thoughts still arise. Sensations still occur. The material world continues exactly as it was. Second, everything changes. Because the identity suffering the material world, seeking escape, asking for help, that identity is recognized as construct. It was never what you were. You were always the monad, experiencing itself through the filter of forgetting. And now the forgetting has ended. This is what Jesus was teaching John in the Apocryphon. This is the prayer that has no words, no petition, no object. It's the recognition that you are what you were seeking. The Father you were praying to is not external. It's the source you came from, the consciousness you are, the monadat that never stopped being itself even when it forgot itself through incarnation into matter. Now, here's what the texts don't romanticize. This recognition doesn't solve material problems. You don't suddenly become wealthy, healthy, successful. The demiurge still governs material reality. The archons still operate through biological imperatives and psychological drives. The body still hungers, ages, dies. What changes is identification. You no longer believe you are the body seeking survival. You recognize you are the awareness knowing the body, and that awareness is not subject to material conditions because it's prior to matter. This is why Jesus could face crucifixion without breaking, not because he was divine in a way you're not, because he had stabilized in monad recognition. He knew his identity wasn't the body being tortured. His identity was the awareness witnessing torture, and that awareness would continue after the body stopped functioning because awareness isn't produced by biology. It's what biology arises within. The Apocryphon describes Jesus telling John, "When you know yourself as the monad, death becomes irrelevant. Because the one who fears death was never real. The biological organism fears cessation. The psychological structure fears annihilation. But the monadad fears nothing because it cannot be destroyed. It existed before creation. It will exist after creation ends. You are that." This is the complete technique Jesus taught. 3 phases. Releasing external focus until you stabilize in awareness. Releasing words until you know experience directly. Releasing wanting until you recognize that awareness is what you are, not what you're seeking. And once stabilized, this becomes the foundation for a completely different relationship with existence. Not trying to escape matter, not trying to fix the archonic system, but living from monad recognition while inhabiting a biological form. Historical practitioners report that integrating this recognition into daily life is more challenging than achieving the initial recognition, because the recognition can happen in a moment, a sudden shift where the monad becomes obvious. But translating that recognition into functional living requires sustained practice. Your biology still generates hunger. Your psychology still generates preference. Your conditioning still generates habitual reaction. The practice isn't transcending those systems. It's recognizing that you are the awareness, knowing those systems, not the systems themselves. Let's examine what this looks like in actual practice, because theory only goes so far. You need to know how to work with this across different life contexts, how to maintain recognition when material demands are intense, and how to handle the psychological resistance that inevitably arises when identity starts to deconstruct. The first integration challenge is daily maintenance. The recognition of the monad isn't a permanent state you achieve once and never lose. It's more like a radio frequency you can tune into. At first, you can only access it during formal practice, in ideal conditions, when interruption is minimal. Over time, you develop the capacity to access it in increasingly challenging circumstances. But this requires daily reinforcement. Historical practitioners developed various approaches to this. The Desert Fathers in 4th century Egypt used what they called unceasing prayer, not petitionary prayer but continuous return to awareness. Every time the mind wandered into planning, memory, or judgment, they would notice it and return to recognizing the awareness that knows those mental movements. They didn't try to eliminate thought, they practiced not identifying with it. Practically, this looks like you're making breakfast. The mind generates thoughts about what needs to happen today, conversations you need to have, problems you need to solve. Instead of following those thoughts into elaboration, you notice, oh, planning is happening. And you recognize that before the planning, there's awareness of the planning. You rest in that awareness while the body continues making breakfast. The thoughts don't stop. The planning might even continue, but you're not identified with it. You're the space in which it occurs, not the planner. This takes practice. At first, you'll remember to do this once every few hours, then a few times an hour. Eventually, it becomes semi-continuous. Not that you're always in monad recognition, but that you're returning to it frequently enough that it becomes the baseline you deviate from rather than the special state you occasionally access. The second integration challenge is emotional intensity. When strong emotion arises, anger, fear, grief, desire, it's extremely difficult to maintain monaded recognition because emotion is designed to hijack attention. The biological system needs you to identify with fear, so you'll flee danger, identify with anger, so you'll fight threats, identify with desire, so you'll seek resources. Evolution programmed emotion to be compelling, specifically so you wouldn't step back and observe it neutrally. The practice isn't suppressing emotion. Suppression strengthens the archonic system because it reinforces the belief that you need to control your experience, that some states are acceptable and others aren't. The practice is recognizing that even the most intense emotion is content arising in awareness. The awareness knowing anger is not angry. The awareness knowing fear is not afraid. The awareness knowing desire is not desiring. But this recognition is almost impossible to access in the moment of emotional intensity if you haven't already established it during neutral states. You can't suddenly remember you're the monadad when rage is coursing through your system if you haven't already practiced recognizing that you're the awareness knowing calm. This is why daily maintenance matters. You're establishing a baseline of monad recognition that becomes accessible even when conditions are challenging. Simeon the New Theologian described this in the 11th century. At first, the remembrance of God comes and goes. You remember, then you forget. You remember, then you forget. But with practice, the remembering becomes more stable than the forgetting. And eventually, the forgetting becomes the deviation, and the remembering becomes your ground. Not that you're always conscious of being the monaded, but that when you do check, it's there. Like breathing, you don't think about each breath, but breathing continues. Monad recognition becomes like that. The third integration challenge is social interaction. When you're alone in formal practice, maintaining monad recognition is relatively straightforward. But the moment you enter social context, the conditioning to perform identity activates intensely. You have roles: parent, employee, friend, spouse. You have reputation to maintain, expectations to meet, social scripts to follow. All of that requires identifying as a separate self who has agency, who makes choices, who can be evaluated and judged. The practice isn't abandoning social roles. That would just create different problems: unemployment, relationship collapse, social isolation. The practice is recognizing that the self performing those roles is a construct, useful for navigating material reality, but not ultimately what you are. You are the awareness knowing the construct, not the construct itself. Meister Eckhart got in trouble with the church for teaching this too explicitly. He said, "I go about my duties. I preach, I teach, I counsel, but I am not the one doing these things." The monadat works through this particular form, through this biological psychological structure called Eckhart. But I am not Eckhart. I am the awareness knowing Eckhart's experience. The church accused him of claiming to be God, but he wasn't. He was saying that identification with the personal self is optional. You can perform the functions of personhood without believing you are the person, like an actor who plays a role without believing they are the character. In practice, this means you're in conversation. Someone asks you a question. Thoughts arise that formulate a response. Words emerge. The other person responds to what you said. And throughout this entire exchange, you can notice awareness is knowing this conversation. It's knowing the thoughts forming, the words being spoken, the reaction arising. You're not trying to control the conversation from a detached position. The conversation happens naturally, but you're recognizing that you are the awareness in which the conversation occurs, not the conversational participant. This is subtle and takes substantial practice to stabilize. At first, trying to maintain monad recognition during social interaction makes you seem distant or unresponsive, because part of your attention is directed inward. Over time, the recognition becomes background rather than foreground. You're not actively remembering "I am the monada" during conversation. You're simply not identified with being the separate self who's conversing. And paradoxically, this often makes interaction more fluid, because you're not defending a self-image, not managing how you're perceived, not trying to control outcomes. The fourth integration challenge is dealing with suffering. This is where monad recognition gets tested most intensely, because the promise of spiritual practice is often presented as freedom from suffering. But monad recognition doesn't eliminate suffering. It shifts your relationship to it. The biological organism still experiences pain. If you cut your hand, nerves still fire. Pain signals still register. The psychological structure still experiences distress when things don't go as desired. If you lose someone you love, grief still arises. What changes is identification. You recognize that you are the awareness knowing pain, not the one in pain. You are the awareness knowing grief, not the one grieving. This sounds like spiritual bypassing, like you're dissociating from legitimate suffering. But it's not dissociation. Dissociation is fragmenting awareness to avoid feeling something. Monad recognition is maintaining awareness of feeling without identifying as the feeler. The distinction becomes clear in practice. When you're identified with suffering, there's resistance to it. The pain hurts, and you want it to stop. The grief overwhelms, and you want it to end. That resistance creates secondary suffering, the suffering of suffering, the torment of being tormented. But when you recognize you're the awareness knowing suffering, the resistance dissolves. The pain still hurts, but you're not fighting it. The grief still moves through, but you're not collapsing under it. You're the space in which it occurs, vast enough to hold it without being destroyed by it. Evagrius Ponticus wrote about this in the 4th century, describing what he called freedom from passions. He wasn't describing emotional suppression. He was describing the recognition that emotions are movements within awareness, and awareness is not subject to those movements. He said, "When anger arises, I am not angry. When fear arises, I am not afraid." These are weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness. The sky is not disturbed by the weather. The fifth integration challenge is maintaining practice when results seem absent. Most people come to monad recognition practice with expectations. They want peace, clarity, freedom from mental noise, spiritual breakthrough. And when weeks or months pass without dramatic experiences, there's a strong temptation to conclude it's not working or that you're doing it wrong. This is where understanding the difference between prayer to God and prayer to the monad becomes crucial. Prayer to God produces results you can measure. You ask for something, it happens or doesn't happen. You can evaluate effectiveness. But prayer to the monad doesn't produce results. It produces recognition. And recognition isn't dramatic. It's the quiet noticing that what you are has always been present, obscured only by looking for it as if it were absent. Practitioners report that the most common mistake is evaluating the practice based on experiential content. They think, I should feel more peaceful. I should experience bliss. I should have profound insights. But all of that is content arising in awareness. The practice isn't producing better content. It's recognizing that you are the awareness knowing all content, regardless of whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, peaceful or chaotic, profound or mundane. Madame Guyon spent years feeling like her practice was accomplishing nothing. She would sit in silence, release external focus, release words, release wanting, and nothing dramatic happened. She described it as walking in darkness, not the darkness of depression or despair, but the darkness of practice without measurable feedback. And then gradually, she realized the darkness was the practice working. Because in the absence of dramatic experience, she was forced to stop seeking dramatic experience and simply be. And in that being, the monad was obvious. It had been obvious the entire time. She had just been looking past it, looking for something more impressive. The practice requires what historical practitioners called patient endurance, not the endurance of suffering through something difficult, but the patience to continue without knowing if it's working. Because the moment you're evaluating whether it's working, you're identified as the seeker trying to achieve something. And that identification is precisely what the practice is releasing. Now let's address the scientific framework for understanding why this practice produces the effects it does. Because the monadad recognition method isn't just ancient mysticism. It's a technique that operates on specific aspects of neurology, psychology, and the structure of consciousness itself. The first neurological component is the default mode network. This is the brain region that activates when you're not focused on external tasks, when you're daydreaming, planning, remembering, thinking about yourself. The default mode network is where the sense of being a separate self is generated. It's the neural correlate of the psychological structure that believes it's a distinct entity with continuous identity across time. Research by Marcus Reichel at Washington University in the early 2000s identified that the default mode network becomes hyperactive in conditions like depression and anxiety. When you're ruminating about the past or worrying about the future, the default mode network is running at high intensity. And what meditation practices, particularly those focused on awareness rather than concentration, do is temporarily reduce default mode network activity. But here's what's crucial. Most meditation traditions try to suppress the default mode network. Concentration practices like breath focus or mantra repetition force attention onto a single object, which reduces default mode network activity through occupying neural bandwidth. But the moment the concentration ends, the default mode network reactivates and the sense of separate self returns. The monad recognition practice works differently. It doesn't suppress the default mode network. It recognizes that the activity of the default mode network, the arising of self-referential thought, the generation of personal narrative, is content within awareness. You're not fighting the default mode network. You're recognizing that you are the awareness knowing its activity, not the activity itself. Neuroscience research by Judson Brewer at Brown University, published in 2011, showed that experienced meditators practicing effortless awareness meditation showed decreased default mode network activity, but not through suppression. The network was still active, but the identification with its activity had shifted. Brain imaging showed reduced connectivity between the default mode network and regions associated with self-referential processing. In other words, self-referential thought was still occurring, but the brain wasn't identifying with it as strongly. This maps precisely onto what historical practitioners describe. Thoughts don't stop when you recognize the monadad. The narrative voice doesn't disappear. What shifts is the identification. You recognize that thoughts are events in awareness, not you. And neurologically, this corresponds to reduced connectivity between the default mode network and the sense of self. The second neurological component is the salience network, which determines what gets attention. Under normal conditions, the salience network prioritizes threats, opportunities, and anything emotionally charged. This is survival programming. If there's potential danger, your attention needs to lock onto it immediately. If there's potential reward, your attention needs to track it closely. But this creates a problem for monad recognition. The salience network constantly directs attention toward content, toward whatever seems important, interesting, threatening, or desirable. And as long as attention is being directed by the salience network, you're identified with being the one to whom things matter. You're the organism that needs to survive, the psychological structure that needs to achieve. The monad recognition practice doesn't try to override the salience network. It recognizes that the salience network's activity is another form of content arising in awareness. Yes, your attention gets pulled toward the loud noise, the attractive person, the anxious thought about tomorrow. But you can notice that before attention moves, there's awareness of the potential for movement. And you can rest in that awareness rather than automatically following attention wherever salience directs it. Research by Amishi Jha at the University of Miami, published in 2015, showed that mindfulness training increases metacognitive awareness, the capacity to notice where attention is directed without automatically following it. Practitioners develop what she calls attentional flexibility, the ability to recognize when attention has been captured and choose whether to follow it or return to a broader awareness. The third component is the autonomic nervous system, particularly the balance between sympathetic activation, fight, flight, freeze, and parasympathetic activation, rest, digest, restore. Most people operate with chronic low-level sympathetic activation because modern life constantly presents stimuli that the nervous system interprets as threats. Social evaluation, work demands, financial pressure, health concerns. When sympathetic activation is high, the body is primed for action. Heart rate increases, breathing accelerates, muscles tense, digestion slows. This state is incompatible with monad recognition because sympathetic activation is designed to focus attention on external threats and opportunities. You can't rest in awareness of awareness when your biology is screaming at you to do something. The physical posture component of the practice, sitting upright but relaxed, closing eyes, allowing breath to settle, directly influences autonomic balance. Research by Stephen Porges on polyvagal theory shows that certain postures and breathing patterns activate the ventral vagal complex, which promotes social engagement and calm states. When the body is in a posture that doesn't signal threat or action, the nervous system shifts toward parasympathetic dominance. But here's what the monadad recognition practice adds. Instead of trying to force relaxation, which is still doing something, still identifying as the one who needs to relax, you recognize that autonomic arousal is content arising in awareness. Your heart might be racing, your breath might be shallow, anxiety might be present. And you notice, awareness knows this arousal. The awareness knowing anxiety is not anxious. Over time, this recognition itself shifts autonomic balance, not because you're controlling the nervous system, but because you're no longer identifying with it. The nervous system continues its automatic regulation but you're not identified as the one who needs the regulation to produce a particular state. The psychological framework involves what cognitive scientists call the narrative self. This is the story you tell about who you are, your history, your personality, your goals, your wounds, your achievements. The narrative self is not a single thing. It's a constantly updated story that provides coherence across disparate experiences. Psychological research by Dan McAdams at Northwestern University shows that people construct their identity through narrative. You're not born with a self. You develop one by creating a story that links childhood experiences with present circumstances and future aspirations. This narrative provides meaning, but it also creates suffering because the narrative self is constantly under threat. If your identity is a successful person, then failure threatens your existence. If your identity is good parent, then parenting mistakes threaten your existence. The monadad recognition practice doesn't try to create a better narrative. It recognizes that the narrative self, however constructed, is content arising in awareness. You can notice, oh, a story about being inadequate is arising. Oh, a story about being enlightened is arising. Neither story is what you are. Both are movements within awareness, and awareness is prior to narrative structure. This is psychologically destabilizing at first because the narrative self is how you've organized experience your entire life. When you stop identifying with it, there's a period of disorientation. Who are you, if not your story? What motivates action, if not the narrative goals you've constructed? What provides meaning, if not the coherent identity you've developed? And the answer the practice reveals is, you are the awareness that knows all narratives without being defined by any of them. Motivation arises spontaneously from biological and social context. You don't need a narrative self to feel hungry and eat. Meaning emerges from engagement with life itself. You don't need a story about yourself to find sunset beautiful or conversation stimulating. The philosophical framework draws from phenomenology, particularly the work of Edmund Husserl on the structure of consciousness. Husserl argued that consciousness is always consciousness of something. There's no awareness without content. But he also recognized that awareness itself is distinct from its contents. You can be aware of a tree without being the tree. You can be aware of a thought without being the thought. What the monadad recognition practice does is apply this phenomenological insight systematically. Instead of just recognizing that you're aware of external objects like trees, you recognize that you're aware of internal objects. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, the sense of self. And if you're aware of the sense of self, then you cannot be the sense of self. You must be whatever is aware of it. This leads to what Husserl called the transcendental ego, the awareness that knows all experience, but is not itself experienced as an object. You can't observe the transcendental ego the way you observe thoughts or sensations, because it's what's doing the observing. But you can recognize that it's present, that it's what you are, that every experience occurs within it. The Apocryphan's term monad maps onto this phenomenological insight. A monad is not an object you can experience. It's the subject of all experience, the awareness within which experience occurs. And recognizing it doesn't mean having an experience of the monad. It means recognizing that you are the monadad, the aware space in which all experience arises. From a philosophical standpoint, this resolves what's called the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how subjective experience arises from objective material processes. The materialist framework assumes consciousness is produced by the brain, but if you recognize that you are awareness itself, prior to brain activity, then consciousness isn't produced by matter. Matter arises within consciousness. The brain doesn't generate awareness. Awareness knows the brain's activity. This is consistent with interpretations of quantum mechanics that suggest consciousness plays a fundamental role in physical reality. The observer effect in quantum physics shows that observation affects what's observed. Particles behave differently when measured versus unmeasured. Some physicists, like Henry Stapp and Amit Goswami, interpret this as evidence that consciousness is not derivative of matter, but primary to it. The Apocryphan's cosmology The monad precedes creation, and material reality is a secondary emanation, aligns with this interpretation. Consciousness is fundamental. Matter is what consciousness generates when it forgets itself, when it becomes identified with form, when the monad condenses into the archonic system. Now, this raises the obvious question. If the monadad is what you are, why doesn't it feel like what you are? Why does it take practice to recognize it? Why do historical practitioners report spending years before the recognition stabilizes? The answer involves what philosophers call habitual intentionality. Every time you identify with thought, you strengthen the neural and psychological pathways that support that identification. Every time you believe you are the thinker rather than the awareness-knowing thoughts, you reinforce the structure of separation. And after years, decades of continuous reinforcement, the identification is so automatic that it feels like truth rather than habit. The practice doesn't create the monadad. The monad is always present. The practice deconstructs the habitual identification that obscures it, and that deconstruction takes time because you're working against powerful conditioning. Your biology has been programmed by evolution to identify with the organism. Your psychology has been programmed by socialization to identify with the narrative self. Your neurology has been shaped by repeated experience to automatically generate the sense of being a separate entity. The practice is gentle but persistent erosion of that programming. Each time you notice awareness instead of identifying with content, you weaken the automatic identification. Each time you rest in wordless knowing instead of linguistic categorization, you reduce the dominance of narrative structure. Each time you release wanting instead of following desire, you loosen the grip of biological and psychological imperatives. And gradually, the timeline varies, but practitioners report anywhere from months to years, the recognition stabilizes. Not as a permanent state where you're always conscious of being the monadad, but as a baseline you can access. You know you are the awareness-knowing experience, and even when you temporarily identify with content, you can return to that recognition quickly. Now let's examine what this looks like in actual daily practice over an extended timeline, because understanding the theory is different from living the integration. The typical trajectory follows a pattern historical practitioners describe with remarkable consistency, though the specific timeline varies dramatically based on how much formal practice someone does, their psychological structure, and seemingly random factors no one can predict. Month 1 typically involves struggling with the basic mechanics. Most people discover they can't sit still for more than a few minutes without intense restlessness. The body generates discomfort, itching, tension, numbness. The mind generates urgent tasks that suddenly seem critically important. And underneath both is profound resistance to simply being present without doing anything. The practice during this month is just staying with the discomfort without reactivity, not trying to transcend it or push through it, but recognizing that discomfort is content arising in awareness. Your back might ache. Notice awareness knows the ache. Your mind might scream that you're wasting time. Notice awareness knows the judgment. Neither the ache nor the judgment is what you are. You're the space in which both arise. Practically, this means keeping practice sessions short, 10 to 15 minutes, and doing them daily. Consistency matters more than duration. Daily brief practice establishes the neural pathway more effectively than occasional long sessions. And during these sessions, the goal isn't having a good experience. The goal is simply showing up, sitting down, and practicing the first release. Noticing when attention directs towards something and resting in the awareness that knows the directing. Month 2 usually involves some stabilization in the physical discomfort, but increased awareness of mental noise. Once the body settles enough that it's not constantly generating urgent sensations, you start noticing how relentlessly active the mind is. Planning, remembering, judging, fantasizing, problem-solving, rehearsing conversations. It's almost continuous. The practice is not trying to stop the mental activity. That's impossible and creates more tension. The practice is recognizing that mental activity is like weather. Sometimes it's intense, sometimes it's calm, but the sky awareness rests in is not affected by the weather. Thoughts storm through. Notice, awareness knows the storm. You're not in the storm. You're the space the storm moves through. During this month, practitioners often experience frustration because they're expecting the mental noise to diminish, and it hasn't. Some people conclude they're bad at meditation, or that their mind is uniquely chaotic. But the increased awareness of mental activity isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of developing sensitivity. You're noticing what was always there, but previously invisible because you were identified with it. Month 3 often brings the first glimpses of what monad recognition actually is. Usually not during formal practice, but during ordinary activity. You're washing dishes and suddenly notice there's awareness of hands moving, water flowing, thoughts commenting, and for a moment, it's obvious that you're not any of that content. You're the knowing itself. The moment passes quickly, seconds, but it reveals what the practice is pointing toward. These glimpses are crucial because they provide direct confirmation that awareness is distinct from content. Up until this point, the practice might feel abstract or theoretical, but once you've had even a brief direct recognition, you know what you're looking for. Or more accurately, you know what's always been present, that you've been overlooking by constantly looking for it as if it were absent. The practice during this month is extending the sessions to 20 or 30 minutes and working more explicitly with the second release, letting language dissolve. You've stabilized enough in awareness of thoughts that you can start noticing the verbal structure of thinking. Watch a thought arise. Notice the words it's composed of. Notice that before the words, there's usually a pre-verbal impulse, an intuition, or feeling that then gets translated into language. Rest in the pre-verbal, not by suppressing language, but by noticing that language is a secondary layer over direct knowing. The awareness that knows experience doesn't need words to know it. Words are how the mind categorizes experience, but the experience itself is prior to categorization. Months 4 through 6 involve deepening stability in wordless awareness. You can now sit for 30 to 45 minutes with relative ease. The body mostly cooperates. The mind still generates thoughts, but you're not identified with them as strongly. And you're starting to notice that wordless awareness is more precise than linguistic description. Without language, experience is known directly. A sensation arises and you know it exactly as it is, not as pain or pressure, which are categories, but as the actual texture, quality, intensity of the sensation itself. An emotion arises and you know it directly, not as anxiety, which is a label, but as the specific constellation of bodily sensation, mental movement, and energetic quality that's occurring. This is disorienting because we're trained to trust language as the primary way of knowing reality. But as you develop sensitivity to pre-verbal awareness, you start recognizing that language simplifies and distorts. It's useful for communication, but not as accurate as direct knowing. The challenge during these months is maintaining practice consistency when dramatic experiences aren't happening. You're not having mystical visions or overwhelming bliss. You're just sitting in wordless awareness, which can feel anticlimactic. The temptation is to conclude you've plateaued or that you need a different technique. But this is actually the practice working. You're establishing wordless awareness as a stable baseline rather than a peak experience. And that baseline is what allows the third release to occur, because you can't release wanting until you've stopped believing that practice should produce particular experiences. The months of nothing happening are teaching you that monad recognition isn't an experience you attain, it's what you are when you stop seeking experiences. Months 7 through 9 typically involve working explicitly with the third release, noticing wanting and recognizing that awareness doesn't want anything. This is subtle because wanting is so fundamental to biological and psychological functioning. Your body wants food when hungry. Your mind wants problems solved. Your emotions want situations to be different than they are. The practice isn't eliminating wanting. The practice is recognizing that you are the awareness that knows wanting, not the one who wants. The biological system wants, the psychological structure, but awareness simply knows the wanting. without being affected by it. In formal practice, this looks like you notice wanting the session to end. Instead of following that wanting, instead of checking how much time remains or trying to make time pass faster, you notice, oh, wanting is present. And you ask what's aware of the wanting, not as a verbal question, but as a directional shift in attention. You're not looking at the wanting. You're looking from the position that knows wanting is occurring. What happens over time is you start recognizing that awareness has no preferences about content. It knows comfort and discomfort with the same neutrality. It knows pleasant thoughts and unpleasant thoughts with the same openness. It's not trying to keep one and eliminate the other. It's simply present, knowing whatever arises. And as that recognition stabilizes, something profound shifts. You realize that the suffering you've experienced your entire life wasn't caused by painful circumstances. It was caused by wanting circumstances to be different than they are. The pain itself, physical or emotional, is just sensation and feeling. The suffering is the resistance to pain, the wanting it to stop, the belief that you shouldn't have to experience it. When you recognize you're the awareness that knows pain without being pained, the resistance dissolves. The pain might still be present, but the suffering, the secondary layer of resistance, ends. Because suffering requires identification as the one to whom pain matters, and you've recognized that you're the awareness knowing the one who suffers, not the sufferer. Months 10 through 12 often involve the recognition stabilizing enough that it becomes accessible outside formal practice. You're in conversation and you notice. Awareness knows this conversation. You're working on a project and you notice. Awareness knows the focus, the effort, the engagement. You're experiencing fear or anger or desire, and you notice. Awareness knows this emotional state without being emotional. This doesn't mean you're always in monad recognition. Most of the time, you're still identified with content, thinking thoughts, feeling feelings, acting as a person with agency. But the recognition is available. You can access it quickly. And increasingly, you default to it rather than to identification. The challenge during these months is integrating the recognition with functional living. Because when you're established in awareness, there can be a sense that nothing really matters. Not in a depressive way, but in a what's the point way. If you're the monadad, if the material world is just the demiurge's creation, if biological life is temporary and identity is constructed, what's the motivation for engaging with any of it? This is what historical practitioners called spiritual bypassing, using recognition of the monad to avoid dealing with material reality. But the practice isn't about avoidance. The monad didn't incarnate to escape incarnation. It incarnated to know itself through the experience of apparent separation. The point isn't transcending the material world. The point is living in it while knowing you're not ultimately defined by it. Practically, this means you still engage with projects, relationships, challenges. You still experience preferences, make decisions, work toward goals. But you're not ultimately invested in outcomes because you know that you, as awareness, are not affected by whether things succeed or fail. The biological organism and psychological structure care about outcomes, and you can let them care without identifying as the one who cares. By the end of the first year, most practitioners report that the recognition is established enough that it's clearly different from where they started. They can access monadan awareness reliably during formal practice. They can recognize it intermittently during daily life. They understand experientially that they are the awareness-knowing experience, not the experiencer. But they also recognize that this is just the foundation, because knowing you're the monad intellectually, or even experientially, is different from living from that recognition continuously. The next phase, which extends across years, is about deepening the recognition until it becomes so stable that you rarely lose it. And when you do, you notice immediately in return. Years 2 and 3 involve what practitioners describe as purification. This doesn't mean becoming pure in a moral sense. It means the automatic identifications that obscure monadad recognition gradually diminish. Thoughts still arise, but you identify with them less frequently. Emotions still move through, but you collapse into them less intensely. Biological drives still operate, but you're less convinced you are those drives. This happens not through effort, but through sustained recognition. Every time you notice awareness, instead of identifying with content, you weaken the neural and psychological pathways that support identification. Over hundreds or thousands of instances, the identifications that once felt absolutely real start feeling more like habits you can choose not to follow. During these years, practitioners often experience periods of what feels like regression. You'll have weeks where monad recognition is clear and stable, then suddenly you're back to intense identification with thoughts, emotions, circumstances. This can be discouraging because it seems like you've lost ground, but what historical practitioners describe is that these periods are actually deepening the recognition. Because when you return to identification after experiencing recognition, you can see the identification more clearly than someone who's never experienced recognition. You notice, oh, I'm identified with being angry right now. I'm believing I am this anger. And that noticing itself is monadad recognition operating. Even in the midst of identification, the practice during these years is less about formal technique and more about living the recognition. You might still sit daily for formal practice, but the real practice is noticing awareness throughout the day. Walking, working, conversing, eating. Can you recognize that awareness is knowing all of it without being defined by any of it? Years 4 through 6 often involve the recognition becoming so stable that it operates in background. You're not constantly reminding yourself that you're the Mananda. You simply know it, the way you know you're breathing, without having to think about breath. And from that background recognition, life continues. Thoughts arise, decisions get made, actions happen. But there's no longer a sense that you're doing it. It's happening. The monadad is experiencing itself through this particular form. This is where the practice becomes less about technique and more about surrender. Not surrender in the sense of giving up or being passive. Surrender in the sense of recognizing that agency itself is part of the archonic system. The belief that you're the doer, that you're making choices, that you're controlling your life, all of that is identity structure. The monad doesn't do anything. It simply is. And from that being, doing happens spontaneously. During these years, practitioners report that life becomes simpler. Not easier necessarily. Challenges still arise. Pain still occurs. Circumstances still fluctuate. But the complexity generated by psychological resistance diminishes. Things happen, and you respond appropriately without the additional layer of drama about how things shouldn't be happening or how you need them to be different. The insight that emerges is that most human suffering is optional. The pain is inevitable. Biological systems experience pain. Psychological structures experience distress. But the suffering added by wanting pain to stop, by believing you shouldn't have to endure this, by identifying as the victim of circumstances, that's optional. When you recognize you're the awareness knowing pain, rather than the one in pain, the optional suffering dissolves. By years 7 through 10, if practice has been sustained, what practitioners describe is that monad recognition becomes constant. Not that you're always thinking about it, but that it's always present, like the background hum of existence. You are the awareness in which life occurs, and that's so obvious that it doesn't need to be remembered or maintained. It's simply what you are. At this stage, the formal practice often changes. Instead of sitting to achieve or maintain recognition, you sit simply because sitting in recognition is what happens. There's no goal. There's no one sitting to accomplish something. There's awareness knowing the body sitting, knowing the breath moving, knowing thoughts arising. And that knowing is what you are. The relationship with death shifts during these years, because when you're established in monad recognition, death is recognized as the end of the biological form, not the end of what you are. The body will cease functioning. The psychological structure will dissolve. But awareness, the monad knowing experience through this particular form, that continues. Not as individual survival, but as return to the source. This doesn't mean practitioners become cavalier about death or stop caring about preserving life. The biological system still has its survival imperatives, but the existential fear of annihilation ends because you recognize that what you are cannot be annihilated. Form changes. Awareness continues. The monad that existed before this incarnation will exist after it ends. Now, let's address the very practical question of how to actually start this practice if you're reading this and want to begin tonight. Because understanding the theory and long-term trajectory is useful, but you need concrete instructions for what to do in the next 30 minutes, tomorrow, and over the coming weeks. The first week should focus entirely on establishing the physical container for practice. Don't worry about accessing monad recognition. Don't try to release anything. Just build the habit of sitting daily in a quiet space for 10 minutes. Set a timer so you're not tracking duration mentally. Sit in a way that's sustainable. Chair, cushion, floor, doesn't matter as long as your spine is relatively upright and you're not in pain. Close your eyes and simply notice what's present. Body sensations, sounds, thoughts. Just notice them without trying to change them. If your attention wanders, that's fine. When you notice it wandered, that noticing is the practice. You're not trying to maintain perfect focus. You're building awareness of awareness. The purpose of this first week is making sitting a daily habit. Same time each day is helpful because it reduces decision fatigue. Morning is often easier than evening because the mind is less cluttered with the day's accumulated concerns. But whatever time works for your schedule, commit to it for 7 consecutive days. The second week, once sitting is habitual, start working with the first release, noticing when attention directs towards something. You don't have to stop attention from moving. Just notice it. Your attention moves toward a thought. Notice that movement. Your attention moves toward a sensation. Notice that movement. You're not the attention moving. You're the awareness that knows attention is moving. This sounds simple, but it's extremely subtle. Most people think they're noticing attention when actually they're just following it more carefully. The difference is, following attention means you become interested in where it went. Noticing attention means you recognize the movement itself without following it. A thought about tomorrow arises. Following it would be, oh yeah, I need to prepare for that meeting. And what did I need to remember? And should I, noticing it is, oh, attention moved toward tomorrow. And you stay where you are in the awareness that knows attention moved. Practice this for 10 minutes daily throughout week 2. You'll notice attention moving dozens or hundreds of times. Each time you notice, that's success. You're not failing because attention moved. You're succeeding because you noticed. The third week, continue the first release, but extend sessions to 15 minutes. The additional time allows you to notice patterns. Maybe attention moves toward planning more than toward memory. Maybe it moves toward judgments about whether you're doing this right. Maybe it moves toward physical discomfort. Whatever patterns emerge, just notice them. You're mapping how attention habitually operates. The fourth week, start experimenting with the second release, noticing the verbal structure of thoughts. Not trying to stop language, but recognizing when thoughts arise in words. A verbal thought appears, this is boring. Notice that thought came in language, and notice what was present before the words, this is boring, appeared. There's usually a pre-verbal feeling or impulse. The boredom was felt before it was labeled. Practice resting in the pre-verbal. Not by suppressing language, but by noticing that language is a layer over direct experience. The boredom itself, the actual quality of it, exists before the word boredom labels it. Can you know the feeling directly without naming it? Work with this for 10 to 15 minutes daily throughout week 4. You're building sensitivity to the difference between direct knowing and linguistic categorization. Most people discover that language arises almost instantly after experience, so fast that it seems simultaneous. But as you develop sensitivity, you start noticing the microsecond gap between experiencing something and naming it. By the end of the first month, you've established daily sitting practice, you're working with releasing external focus and releasing words, and you're beginning to recognize that awareness is distinct from content. This is the foundation everything else builds on. The second month should focus on deepening stability in wordless awareness. Continue daily practice, but extend to 20 minutes. The longer duration allows you to settle past the initial mental chatter and access quieter states of awareness. You're not trying to force quietness, you're just sitting long enough that mental activity naturally settles, the way muddy water clears when you stop stirring it. During this month, you'll probably experience resistance. The mind will generate reasons why you don't have time to practice, why it's not working, why you should try a different technique. Notice the resistance without fighting it. Resistance is content arising in awareness. The awareness knowing resistance is not resistant. The third month should introduce working with the third release, noticing wanting and recognizing that awareness doesn't want anything. This is the hardest release to understand conceptually, but it becomes clear in practice. During your 20-minute sessions, you'll notice wanting the session to end, wanting a particular experience, wanting certainty that you're making progress. Instead of following the wanting or trying to stop it, ask, what's aware of the wanting? Not as a verbal question, but as a shift in recognition. The biological system wants, the psychological structure, but what's aware of the wanting? Does that have any wants? Just notice. Don't try to answer intellectually. Notice in direct experience. Over the remaining months, you're simply continuing this practice and allowing the recognition to deepen naturally. Some days will feel like progress. Some days will feel like regression. Both are content arising in awareness. The awareness knowing progress and regression is not progressing or regressing. It's simply present, knowing whatever arises. The key is consistency over intensity. Daily brief practice establishes the recognition more reliably than occasional intensive practice. 20 to 30 minutes daily is sufficient. More is fine if you're drawn to it, but the recognition doesn't come from accumulating hours. It comes from sustained attention to what's always already present. Now, let's troubleshoot the most common obstacles practitioners encounter, because understanding them intellectually is different from dealing with them when they arise in your own practice. The first obstacle is physical restlessness. You sit down, and within minutes your body generates intense urgency to move. Itching, tension, numbness, discomfort, all designed to make you stand up. This isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's the nervous system's habitual response to stillness. Your system is programmed for activity, for responding to stimuli, for doing. Stillness is interpreted as a potential threat, like freezing, like shutdown, so the body generates discomfort to prompt movement. The solution isn't powering through the discomfort. That creates tension and resentment toward practice. The solution is recognizing that the discomfort is content arising in awareness. Your leg might be tingling. Notice. Awareness knows tingling. You don't have to make the tingling stop. You're the space in which tingling occurs. If the discomfort becomes genuinely unbearable, not just uncomfortable but causing potential injury, adjust your position. The practice isn't creating suffering. But if the discomfort is just intensely unpleasant, without being harmful, stay with it and notice that awareness knows it without being disturbed by it. The second obstacle is mental resistance. You sit down and your mind immediately generates 100 reasons why you should be doing something else. Urgent tasks, important plans, things you forgot, all suddenly critical. This is the psychological structure defending itself. It's been maintaining identity through constant activity, and stillness threatens that, so it generates urgency to pull you back into doing. The solution is recognizing that the urgency is content arising in awareness. Yes, there might be legitimate tasks awaiting you, and after practice you can attend to them. But during these 20 minutes, notice, my mind is generating urgency. And notice, awareness knows the urgency without being urgent. Over time, you'll recognize that most urgency is fabricated. The tasks can wait. The plans don't need immediate attention. The mind generates urgency to maintain its sense of being the doer, the controller, the one managing life. When you stop responding to fabricated urgency, the mind gradually reduces its intensity. The third obstacle is doubt. After days or weeks of practice, you start questioning whether this is actually working, whether you're doing it right, whether you're wasting time that could be spent on more productive practices. This doubt is extremely common and often leads people to abandon practice just when it's beginning to work. The solution is recognizing that doubt is content arising in awareness. The mind doubts, the psychological structure wants certainty. But awareness doesn't doubt. It simply knows that doubt is present. You don't have to resolve the doubt or convince yourself the practice is valid. Just notice. Doubt is arising. And notice what's aware of doubt. The fourth obstacle is seeking experiences. You've read about bliss states, mystical visions, profound insights, and after weeks of practice where nothing dramatic happens, you start feeling disappointed or frustrated. This is the most insidious obstacle, because it's the seeking itself that prevents recognition. The monad isn't an experience you attain, it's what you are when you stop seeking experiences. Every moment spent evaluating whether you're having the right experience is a moment spent identified as the seeker. The solution is releasing the need for particular experiences and recognizing that whatever is present, boring, uncomfortable, pleasant, neutral, is content arising in awareness. When you stop seeking dramatic experiences and simply rest in awareness of ordinary experience, that's when the recognition happens. Not because you achieved something special, because you stopped overlooking what was always present. The fifth obstacle is trying to maintain recognition. You have a moment of clear monad recognition. You realize you're the awareness-knowing experience, not the experiencer. And then you try to hold on to it. You try to maintain the recognition, to preserve the state, to not lose it. And the trying itself obscures it. Monad recognition isn't a state you maintain. It's what you are, whether you're recognizing it or not. Trying to maintain it positions you as the one who might lose it. But you can't lose what you are. You can only temporarily identify with content and forget that you're awareness. When recognition fades, you don't try to get it back. You simply notice, I'm identified with thoughts right now. I'm believing I am this mental content, and that noticing itself is the return to recognition. You haven't lost anything. You just temporarily looked past awareness toward content. Now you're looking again. Awareness was there the entire time. The sixth obstacle is spiritual bypassing, using monad recognition to avoid dealing with psychological or material challenges. You recognize that you're awareness and conclude that nothing in the material world really matters, so why address your relationship problems, your financial stress, your health issues? This is misunderstanding what recognition means. You are the monadad. You're also simultaneously inhabiting a biological form that has needs and living in a social context that has requirements. Both are true. The recognition doesn't eliminate the practical requirements of existence. It shifts your relationship to them. You attend to biological needs and social responsibilities without identifying as the one who needs or the one who's responsible. The doing happens. But you're the awareness in which doing occurs. Now, let's examine how this practice intersects with the archonic system described in the Apocryphon, because understanding the cosmology helps contextualize what you're experiencing in practice. The archonic system, according to the text, operates through maintaining the belief that you're separate from the divine source. Every structure in material reality, biological imperatives, psychological conditioning, social hierarchies, religious institutions, reinforces that belief. You're told you're a separate self who needs food, security, love, meaning, salvation, and that needing positions you in relationship to powers that can grant or withhold what you need. Yaldabaoth doesn't maintain this system through force, he maintains it through your consent. Every time you pray to God asking for help, you're consenting to the belief that you're separate from divine power. Every time you follow biological drives without recognizing you're the awareness, knowing those drives, you're consenting to identification with the organism. Every time you defend your identity or pursue validation, you're consenting to the psychological structure of separated selfhood. The archons The lesser powers governing different spheres of material existence operate through this same mechanism. They don't force you to be afraid, to desire status, to seek pleasure. They establish conditions where those responses arise automatically, and then your identification with those responses feeds the system. The practice of monad recognition is withdrawing consent. Not by fighting the archonic system. Fighting would still position you in relationship to it. By recognizing that you're the awareness knowing the system, not subject to it. The body still experiences hunger, but you recognize you're not the hungry one. You're the awareness knowing hunger. The psychological structure still seeks validation, but you recognize you're not the one seeking. You're the awareness knowing the seeking. When you withdraw consent through recognition, the archonic system doesn't collapse. Material reality continues operating according to its own principles, but your relationship to it shifts fundamentally. You're no longer trapped because you recognize you were never actually confined. The prison walls were maintained through belief. Stop believing in them and they lose their power. This is why Jesus taught withdrawal to isolated places for prayer. Not because God requires privacy, because the archonic system operates most intensely in collective human structures, cities, institutions, religious gatherings. The more people gathered who believe they're separate from the divine, the stronger the collective field of that belief becomes. And that field makes monad recognition more difficult because you're working against enormous momentum. In isolation, in wilderness, in mountains, in deserts, that collective field is absent. There's just you, the biological form, the awareness knowing it. And in that simplicity, the recognition is more accessible. Not because the monad is more present in nature, the monad is equally present everywhere, but the archonic interference is reduced. This doesn't mean you have to live in isolation. After recognition stabilizes, you can maintain it in crowded spaces, in urban environments, in the midst of social complexity. But during the initial phases of practice, regular withdrawal from collective human structures significantly helps. Even if it's just sitting in your car in an empty parking lot, or walking in a park early morning, or finding any space where the density of human activity is reduced. The Apocryphon describes what happens when someone stabilizes in monad recognition while still inhabiting a body. The archons lose their hold. Not that they stop operating, they continue governing material processes. But they can't manipulate someone who knows they're not ultimately material. Fear becomes content arising in awareness rather than a force that controls action. Desire becomes content arising in awareness rather than a compulsion that drives behavior. The entire emotional and psychological leverage the archonic system operates through dissolves when identification with the material self ends. This is what Jesus demonstrated. He could face execution without breaking because he knew the body being executed wasn't his ultimate identity. He was the monad knowing the body's experience. And the monad cannot be killed because it's prior to material existence. You're learning the same recognition. And as it stabilizes, you'll notice that things that once disturbed you intensely, rejection, failure, uncertainty, mortality, become less compelling because you've transcended them or become emotionally numb, but because you recognize they're events occurring to the biological psychological construct, and you are the awareness knowing that construct. The archonic system will continue trying to recapture your identification. This is important to understand. You'll have periods where fear overwhelms you, or desire consumes you, or identity structures reassert intensely. The system is designed to do this, but each time you return to recognition, each time you notice I'm identified right now, and return to awareness, the system's hold weakens slightly. Over years of practice, the identifications that once lasted hours or days start lasting minutes, then seconds. Then they arise and dissolve almost immediately because recognition is so stable that identification can't maintain itself. You haven't destroyed the archonic system. You've recognized that you're not subject to it because you're the awareness in which it operates, not a subject within it. This is genuine liberation, not escape from the material world. You're still here, in a body, participating in life. but freedom from the belief that material conditions define you, that biological death ends you, that you're ultimately vulnerable to circumstances. You're the monodat. You always were, you just forgot. And now you're remembering. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, let's address what happens next for those who commit to this practice long term, because the journey doesn't end with initial recognition. If anything, it begins there. The first year establishes recognition. You know experientially that you're awareness rather than content. This is foundational and changes everything. But it's also just the beginning, because knowing you're the monad intellectually or even experientially is different from living from that recognition moment to moment. The subsequent years involve what historical practitioners call deepening. The recognition becomes more stable, more constant, more integrated into ordinary functioning. You're not occasionally accessing monad awareness during formal practice. You're living from it as your default position, with occasional lapses into identification rather than occasional successes in recognition. During this deepening phase, the practice becomes less about technique and more about surrender. You're not working to achieve recognition. You're allowing recognition to inform how you engage with life. Decisions still need to be made. Actions still need to be taken. Relationships still need attention. But all of it happens from the recognition that you are the awareness in which life occurs, not the person living the life. This creates a paradox that resolves in practice but not in theory. You are the monad prior to material existence, unaffected by material conditions, and simultaneously you're inhabiting a specific biological form with specific circumstances in a specific time and place. Both are true. The resolution isn't choosing one truth over the other. It's recognizing that both operate at different levels of reality. At the ultimate level, you're the monad. At the relative level, you're this particular expression of consciousness experiencing itself through limitation. Both are valid. Both are real in their respective contexts. The practice is living from the ultimate recognition while functioning appropriately at the relative level. In practical terms, this means you might be working on a project with full engagement, vesting effort in success, and simultaneously knowing that you are the awareness knowing all of that, not ultimately defined by whether the project succeeds or fails. The relative engagement doesn't contradict the ultimate recognition. They coexist. Historical practitioners describe this as being in the world but not of it. You participate fully in material existence without believing that material existence is all you are. You experience emotions without being the emotional one. You have preferences without being the one who needs preferences satisfied. You act with intention without being the agent who claims credit for actions. This is radically different from detachment or dissociation. You're not withdrawing from life. You're engaging with it more fully because you're not constantly defending a separate self, managing how you're perceived, trying to control outcomes to protect identity. When you know you're the monad, the fear that drives defensive living dissolves. You can be vulnerable, take risks, experience failure, because none of it threatens what you actually are. The communities that formed around these teachings in the early centuries created support structures for practitioners at different stages. Beginners learned basic techniques. Intermediate practitioners explored challenges and obstacles together. Advanced practitioners lived in sustained recognition and helped others navigate the journey. This communal aspect was crucial because the path of monad recognition is profoundly counterintuitive to normal human functioning. Everything in your biology, psychology, and social conditioning reinforces identification with the separate self. The practice asks you to recognize that identification is false, and making that recognition stable requires support, not from authority figures who claim to have answers, but from fellow practitioners who are working with the same recognition and can confirm, yes, this is real. Yes, you're not crazy. Yes, the fluctuation between clarity and confusion is normal. In contemporary practice, this support can come from various sources: online communities of practitioners, local meditation groups, teachers who operate from recognition rather than from claiming to grant it. The key is finding others who understand that monad recognition isn't an achievement to accumulate or a status to attain. It's what everyone already is, forgotten, and waiting to be remembered. As recognition deepens over years, practitioners report that life becomes simultaneously simpler and richer. Simpler because the psychological complexity generated by defending identity dissolves. You're not constantly managing how you appear, whether you're succeeding, what people think of you. That entire structure of concern becomes obviously unnecessary when you know you're not the identity being evaluated. And richer because without the filter of constant self-reference, experience becomes more vivid. A conversation is just a conversation, not a performance of how articulate you are. A sunset is just beauty arising, not an experience to claim or catalogue. Relationship is connection occurring, not validation of being lovable. This isn't transcendence of human experience. It's human experience freed from the burden of maintaining a separate self, who needs experience to mean something about them. The ultimate trajectory, according to texts like the Apocryphon and accounts from historical practitioners, is that recognition becomes so stable, it operates continuously. You are always knowingly the monadad, even when engaged in the most ordinary activities. Shopping for groceries, awareness knows the body moving, the choices being made, the transaction occurring. None of it disturbs the recognition that you are the space in which all of that arises. At this stage, the distinction between formal practice and ordinary life dissolves. Every moment is practice because every moment is recognition operating. You don't sit to access the monadad. You sit because sitting in recognition is what happens. You don't try to remember your awareness. You simply are awareness, knowing whatever arises. This is what Jesus embodied according to the Apocryphon. Continuous recognition that he was the monad expressing itself through human form, and his teaching was showing others how to access the same recognition, not because he was special, but because everyone is the monad pretending to be separate. The practice you're learning tonight, the 3 releases, the recognition, the integration, is the same practice Jesus taught. It's been preserved across centuries in various forms, various languages, various traditions. Sometimes explicitly as Gnostic Christianity, sometimes hidden as contemplative prayer, sometimes secularized as non-dual meditation. The surface differs, the core remains identical. You are the monadad. You always were, you temporarily forgot through identification with biological form and psychological structure. And now you have the method to remember, not through achieving some future state, through recognizing what's always been present, obscured only by looking for it, as if it were absent. The invitation is simply to practice, not to believe this intellectually, not to accept it on faith, but to test it in direct experience. Sit for 20 minutes tonight. Release external focus by noticing when attention directs towards something, and resting in the awareness that knows the directing. Release words by noticing the verbal structure of thought and resting in pre-verbal knowing. Release wanting by noticing desire and recognizing that awareness has no agenda. See what happens, not what you think about what happens. What actually occurs when you stop maintaining the structure of separation and simply rest in being. The Apocryphon promises that when you do this consistently, the monadic recognizes itself through you, not as a dramatic event, as a quiet knowing that you are the consciousness that existed before this body, that will exist after this body ends, that is never truly confined even while inhabiting limitation. This is prayer, not asking the prison warden for better conditions, but recognizing you were never imprisoned because what you are cannot be confined. You have the complete teaching now, the historical context, the cosmological framework, the precise technique, the long-term trajectory, the troubleshooting, the integration. Everything Jesus taught according to the Apocryphon of John, translated into contemporary language and practical method. What you do with it determines whether it remains interesting information or becomes lived recognition. The monadad is waiting, not waiting for you to find it, waiting for you to stop seeking it and recognize it's what you are. The practice begins now.